When my son, Brandon, handed me that envelope, he didn't just give me a cruise ticket. He handed me my own exile. I looked at the glossy brochure and the boarding pass in my hand, feeling a lump in my throat that I mistook for gratitude. I am Silas Mercer. For 40 years, I ran Mercer Climate Control here in Portland. I spent my life crawling through dusty attics and damp crawl spaces, installing furnaces and fixing AC units so my family could live in comfort. I thought this vacation was Brandon, finally acknowledging that sacrifice. He stood in my living room, the house I bought in '82, the house where his mother took her last breath, and he actually teared up. Brandon told me that I deserved a break from the noise of the city and the ghosts in the hallways. He claimed he wanted me to see the Pacific Ocean from a suite with a balcony, not from the rainy window of my truck. I noticed the anomaly immediately. The ticket clearly stated one-way San Diego to Ensenada. When I questioned it, Brandon laughed. He dismissed my worry with a wave of his hand, insisting that the return trip was the best part. He promised he had arranged a private car to drive me back up the coast, a scenic route he said I needed to experience. I looked into his eyes, searching for the little boy who used to hold the flashlight for me while I fixed the sink. I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that after his mother passed, he was finally stepping up to be the man I tried to raise. I didn't know then that the scenic route was a lie. I didn't know that while I would be staring at the sunset over the ocean, he would be stripping my life for parts. I didn't know that a woman named Joyce was waiting on that ship to process me like expired inventory. If you think you know how far a son will go for a quick payout, you're wrong. But if you want to see how an old HVAC mechanic dismantled a conspiracy to erase his existence, keep listening. I have always been a man who inspects the foundation before admiring the paint. It's a habit from 40 years in the trade. You walk into a house, and while the owners are bragging about the crown molding, I'm looking at the water stains on the ceiling or listening to the rattle in the forced air unit. I know that rot starts quietly. In the dark places you don't look until it's too late. When I boarded that ship in San Diego, the rot was already there. I just hadn't found it yet. The vessel was a floating city of glass and steel, a marvel of engineering that I would have appreciated more if my stomach hadn't been twisting into knots. The staff treated me with that specific brand of excessive politeness reserved for the elderly and the infirm. The young man who carried my single suitcase insisted on walking slowly, matching a pace I wasn't actually using. He asked me 3 times if I needed to stop for a rest before we reached my cabin. I told him that I still climbed ladders to inspect roof units on the weekends, but he just smiled that vacant customer service smile. He assured me that relaxation was the only job I had now. My suite was on the upper deck. It was nicer than the first apartment I shared with my late wife, Martha. There was a bottle of champagne on ice and a bowl of wax-perfect fruit. I stood on the balcony, gripping the railing, watching the California coastline retreat until it was just a gray smudge against the horizon. I felt a profound sense of isolation. Brandon had dropped me at the airport with a hug that felt too loose, too quick. He had checked his watch 4 times during the drive. He told me he had meetings and couldn't wait for me to board, but he promised to call me as soon as I got settled. I checked my phone. No service. I was cut off. That first night, I didn't sleep. The ship hummed, a low-frequency vibration that most people wouldn't notice, but to me, it sounded like a compressor about to fail. I wandered the ship, observing the other passengers. Couples holding hands, families chasing children, groups of friends laughing over cocktails. I was the solitary figure in the beige windbreaker, the old man eating dinner alone at a table meant for 4. I saw the glances. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, wondering why a man my age was drifting aimlessly through a luxury cruise. It was the morning of the second day when the first real crack appeared. I was sitting on the aft deck, nursing a black coffee and watching the wake of the ship turn the dark water into white foam. The air was salty and cold, the way I like it. It clears the head. A woman approached my table. She didn't look like a tourist. She wore a tailored navy blazer and carried a thick leather satchel, walking with a purpose that cut through the leisure atmosphere of the deck. Her name tag read Joyce, Sunset Paradise Living. She pulled out a chair without asking and sat down. Her smile was bright, practiced, and didn't reach her eyes. She addressed me by name, confirming I was Silas Mercer. She said she was relieved to finally locate me, as if I were a lost package she had been tracking. She expressed how wonderful it was that we were on the same transport leg. She told me she had the admission paperwork ready for me to sign now to save time before we docked in Ensenada. I stared at her. I set my coffee down slowly. I asked her what admission she was talking about. I told her I was on a vacation, a gift from my son, and that a driver was meeting me in Mexico for a tour. Joyce's expression shifted. It wasn't surprise. It was a look of practiced patience, the kind a kindergarten teacher gives a toddler who refuses to nap. She opened her satchel and pulled out a manila folder. She slid it across the table. She told me gently that there must be some confusion on my part. She explained that Brandon had coordinated everything weeks ago. She said my transition to the assisted living facility in Ensenada was fully paid for. My hands felt cold, but I opened the folder. The first document was a medical assessment. It was dated 2 weeks prior. It detailed a patient named Silas Mercer who suffered from severe cognitive decline, episodes of disorientation, and an inability to manage daily hygiene or finances. I read the words, but they didn't make sense. I fix my own truck. I do my own taxes. I cooked a pot roast 3 days ago. Then I saw the signature at the bottom. Brandon Mercer, power of attorney. I looked up at Joyce. I told her this was a lie. I told her my mind was as sharp as the tools in my garage. I demanded to know why she had these papers. Joyce sighed. It was a heavy theatrical sigh. She leaned in and lowered her voice, speaking to me in a tone that was humiliatingly soft. She suggested that perhaps I was having one of my bad days. She pointed out that denial was a very common stage in the progression of dementia. She claimed that Brandon had warned her I might become agitated or confused about the arrangement. She told me that the facility in Ensenada was beautiful, secure, and far more affordable than anything in the States. She said Brandon only wanted the best care for me, implying that I was a burden he could no longer carry. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that hits you when a 220-volt line sparks near your face. I pushed the folder back toward her. I told her I wasn't signing anything. I told her there was a mistake and I needed to call my son immediately. Joyce shook her head sadly. She informed me that satellite reception was spotty and expensive and that I shouldn't worry him. She tapped the paper with a manicured fingernail. She pointed to a line item, a $12,000 non-refundable deposit. She mentioned casually that the transfer came directly from my savings account. The world tilted. It wasn't the motion of the ship. It was the sudden, violent realignment of my reality. Brandon didn't just buy a ticket. He had accessed my accounts. He had forged medical history. He had coordinated with this woman to traffic his own father across an international border into a facility where U.S. laws couldn't protect me. I looked at Joyce. I saw the way she was assessing me, not as a man, but as a liability to be managed. She was waiting for me to break, to cry, or to yell. If I yelled, I proved the medical report right. If I became aggressive, I was the danger to himself and others described in the paperwork. I realized then that I was standing on a trapdoor that had already opened. I was falling, and I hadn't even hit the bottom yet. I stood up. My knees were shaking, but I forced them to lock. I told Joyce that I needed to use the restroom. She smiled that condensing smile again. She told me to take my time, that she would be right there when I got back. She said we had plenty of time to get comfortable with the new reality before we docked. I walked away. I didn't go to the restroom. I walked straight toward the elevators, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to think. I needed to see how deep the water really was, because if Brandon had lied about the cruise, and he had lied about my health. I had to know what else he had done. I walked away from Joyce with the steady, measured gait of a man walking across a frozen lake. If I moved too fast, the ice would break. If I stopped, I would sink. I needed solid ground, and on a ship in the middle of the Pacific, the only solid ground was information. I found the ship's executive center tucked away on deck 7 behind frosted glass doors. It was empty, silent, and smelled of lemon cleaner and ozone. There was a row of computer terminals, the kind that looked sleek but probably ran slower than the old desktop in my shop office. A sign on the wall listed the internet rates. They were criminal. $30 for 30 minutes of satellite connection. I swiped my credit card without hesitation. I would have paid $5,000 right then for 5 minutes of truth. I sat down. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For years, people have told me that men my generation don't understand technology. They assume that because my hands are calloused and I prefer a handshake to an email, I'm illiterate in the digital world. They forget that running a successful HVAC business for 4 decades means handling payroll, invoices, supply chains, and tax codes. I know numbers. I know how to track a discrepancy. I logged into my primary checking account first. The screen refreshed pixel by pixel, agonizingly slow. When the balance finally loaded, I didn't gasp. I didn't cry out. I just stared at the screen, feeling a cold numbness spread from my chest to my fingertips. The balance was less than $300. I scrolled through the transaction history. It was a massacre. A series of transfers, all executed in the last 10 days, large round numbers moving out to an account I didn't recognize. There were payments to the cruise line, payments to Sunset Paradise Living, and then the big chunks, 20,000 here, 15,000 there, labeled simply as gift or transfer to B. Mercer. He hadn't just skimmed off the top. He had drained the reservoir dry. I checked my retirement savings, the nest egg I had built up over 40 years of crawling through crawl spaces and sweating in attics. Gone. Liquidated. The penalties for early withdrawal must have been massive, but Brandon hadn't cared. He wasn't looking for long-term value. He was looking for immediate cash. But money is just numbers. Money can be lost, and money can be made. What I found next was the thing that nearly stopped my heart. I opened a new tab and navigated to the real estate listings for my zip code in Portland. I typed in my address, the address where I brought my babies home, where I hosted 4th of July barbecues, where I nursed Martha through those final terrible months. The listing popped up immediately. For sale. Pending. There was a photo of my front porch, the Craftsman pillars I had sanded and restained myself last summer, the rose bushes Martha had planted in '95. The price listed was $850,000. My breath hitched. That house was worth $1.2 million in the current market. Any appraiser would tell you that. But Brandon wasn't selling it for market value. He had priced it for a fire sale. He wanted an all-cash offer, and he wanted a 30-day close. The status pending meant he had already accepted an offer. I looked at the date. The listing had gone live the day I left for San Diego. The picture became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just theft. It was an erasure. Brandon needed me gone, physically gone, so I couldn't contest the sale. He needed me labeled incompetent in a foreign country so that any protest I made would be dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old man. By the time anyone figured out the truth, the house would be sold, the money would be laundered, and I would be rotting in a Mexican nursing home, medicated into silence. He had bet everything on the assumption that I was weak, that I was tired, that I was just an old man ready to be put out to pasture. I closed the browser tabs. I could feel the rage now, a low blue flame at the base of my spine. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of youth. It was the cold, focused burn of a welding torch. I pulled my phone out. Still no service. I used the ship's landline on the desk. It cost $10 a minute. I didn't care. I dialed a number I knew by heart. Leonard answered on the second ring. Leonard has been my lawyer since we were both playing varsity football. He's a man who wears suspenders not for fashion, but because he trusts them more than belts. He sounded surprised to hear from me, assuming I was sipping Mai Tais on the Lido deck. I kept my voice steady. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him to listen carefully and not to interrupt. I laid it out for him: the coerced transfer to the nursing home, the diagnosis of dementia I never received, the empty bank accounts, the pending sale on my house. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Leonard swore, a soft, shocked curse. He asked if I was safe. He asked if I was physically free. I told him I was currently free, but that a woman named Joyce was waiting for me on the deck like a vulture. I gave him his marching orders. I instructed him to file an emergency injunction immediately to freeze the sale of the house. I told him to file a motion to revoke Brandon's power of attorney on the grounds of fraud and elder abuse. I told him to alert the bank's fraud department, but to prioritize the house. I needed a roof to return to. Leonard assured me he would have a judge look at it within the hour. He said he would unleash hell on the title company. But then his voice dropped. He warned me that the legal paperwork wouldn't help me if I was physically stuck in Mexico. He reminded me that once I crossed that border and entered that facility, getting me out would be a diplomatic nightmare. He told me I needed to get off that ship and get back to U.S. soil on my own terms. He said I couldn't let them take me to Ensenada. I looked at the clock on the computer screen. We were scheduled to dock in 3 hours. I told Leonard not to worry about me. I told him to protect the house, and I would handle the rest. I hung up the phone. I stood up and looked at my reflection in the dark window of the executive center. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who had just found a structural crack in a load-bearing wall and knew exactly which sledgehammer to use. I wasn't going to hide in my cabin, and I certainly wasn't going to let Joyce and her orderlies escort me off this ship like a prisoner. I walked out of the business center. I went back to my suite, not to rest, but to prepare. I packed my bag. I put on my sturdy work boots, the ones I wore when I needed traction. I checked my wallet, my passport, my credit card, and $200 in cash I kept tucked in a hidden fold. Brandon thought he was playing a game of chess against an opponent who didn't know the rules. He thought he had taken all my pieces. But he forgot one thing. He forgot that I was the one who built the board. I learned a long time ago that the easiest way to disarm a man or a woman who thinks they are smarter than you is to let them believe it. If you stand tall, they brace for a fight. But if you hunch your shoulders, drag your feet, and look at the ground, they stop watching your hands. They stop checking the exits. When the ship's horn blasted, signaling our approach to the Ensenada dock, I went back to the spot on the deck where Joyce was waiting. I didn't march. I shuffled. I let my mouth hang open slightly, just enough to look vacant. I allowed my hands to tremble, mimicking the palsy that affects so many men my age. When Joyce saw me, her relief was palpable. She didn't see a man who had just liquidated his emergency funds to hire a bulldog lawyer. She saw a confused senior citizen who had wandered off and come back when he got hungry. She scolded me gently, like one would scold a child who strayed too close to the street. She told me we had to hurry because the transport team was waiting at the terminal. She asked if I had my passport. I handed it to her without a word. I let her hold it. Giving up control of that little blue book was the ultimate sign of surrender. She tucked it into her bag, confident that she now owned my freedom. We moved toward the gangway. The crowd was thick, tourists eager for cheap tequila and souvenirs. Joyce kept a firm grip on my elbow, guiding me. I leaned into her support, making myself heavy, acting as if my legs were failing me. I complained about the noise. I asked her twice if Brandon was going to be at the bottom of the ramp. She lied effortlessly. She assured me Brandon was very busy, but was waiting for her call to know I was safe. As we descended the metal ramp, the heat of the Mexican sun hit us. At the bottom, past the customs checkpoint, I saw them. 2 men in white scrubs standing next to a nondescript white van. They weren't medical professionals. I know the look of guys who get paid to handle heavy lifting. They were muscle. They were there to ensure the package didn't resist. But just before we reached them, Joyce's phone rang. She checked the screen and held up a finger, signaling the two men to wait. She answered the call, turning her back to me slightly. She assumed I was too overwhelmed by the crowd and my own cognitive decline to pay attention. That was her mistake. I've spent 40 years listening to the subtle hiss of leaking gas in noisy basements. My hearing is the one thing age hasn't taken from me. She spoke to the person on the other end, Brandon. She told him that she had the asset in custody. She said that as soon as she scanned my admission forms at the facility, she would email the proof of residency to the title company. She explicitly mentioned that this document was the final requirement to clear the property title for the cash close tomorrow morning. She laughed and told him to enjoy the champagne and that he could wire her the second half of her fee by noon. That was the piece of the puzzle I was missing. It wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was a contingency. The buyers of my house must have been nervous about a power of attorney sale. They wanted proof that the owner wasn't just on vacation, but permanently relocated and incapacitated. Joyce's paperwork was the key that unlocked the sale of my home. As long as I was on the street, I was a problem. But once I was behind the walls of Sunset Paradise Living, I was just a statistic. And my house was just an asset to be liquidated. Joyce hung up the phone. She turned back to me, her face composing itself into that mask of fake compassion. She gestured toward the two men and the van. She told me it was time to go to my new home. The men stepped forward. One of them reached for my bag. The other reached for my arm. I looked at the van. Dark windows. No markings. If I got in that vehicle, I would disappear. The laws of the United States would vanish in the rearview mirror. I looked at Joyce. She was smiling, already thinking about her bank transfer. I tightened my grip on the strap of my duffel bag. I shifted my weight from my heels to the balls of my feet. The tremble in my hands vanished. I wasn't going to the van, and I certainly wasn't going to let them take me without a scene that would make the 6 o'clock news. I knew exactly where the taxi stand was. I knew exactly how much adrenaline a terrified old man could summon when his life depended on it. It was time to drop the act. The transition from prey to predator is a mental switch, but it requires a physical spark. For me, that spark was the sight of my passport in Joyce's hand, my identity, my citizenship, my only tether to the life I had built, being held casually, like a grocery receipt she was about to discard. I stopped shuffling. I straightened my spine, feeling the vertebrae click into the alignment that had carried air handling units up 3 flights of stairs for 40 years. The tremors in my hands ceased instantly. Joyce was turning toward the van, expecting me to follow like a well-trained dog. I stepped in close to her, invading her personal space in a way that polite society tells you not to do. I reached out and clamped my hand around her wrist. I didn't squeeze hard enough to break anything, but I squeezed hard enough to let her know that the hand holding her was forged in manual labor, not office work. She gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. Before the 2 orderlies by the van could react, I snatched the passport from her loosened grip. I didn't run. Running implies panic. I walked with aggressive purpose toward the nearest Port Authority officer, a man in a beige uniform standing 20 yards away with a radio on his shoulder. Joyce hissed at me to stop. She signaled the 2 men in scrubs, but they hesitated. They were paid to handle confused geriatrics, not to wrestle a man who looked ready to put someone through a wall. Moreover, they were running a gray market operation. They thrived in the shadows of administrative loopholes. They could not afford a scene in front of federal police. I reached the officer and presented my passport. I spoke loudly enough for the tourists around us to hear. I stated clearly that I was a United States citizen, that I was not boarding that van, and that the woman behind me was attempting to confiscate my documents. The officer looked at me, then at Joyce. Joyce froze. She forced a tight, nervous smile, waved a dismissive hand as if I were just being difficult, and then immediately turned on her heel. She signaled the van to leave. She knew the game was up. She wasn't going to risk an arrest for one commission check. She cut her losses in seconds. I didn't wait for her to disappear. I walked straight to the taxi line. I found a driver with a heavy mustache and a beat-up sedan. I didn't haggle. I pulled out $300 bills, my entire emergency stash, and told him I needed to go to the Tijuana International Airport immediately. I told him the faster he drove, the more he kept. The ride up the Baja coast is usually beautiful. I didn't see any of it. I sat in the back seat, staring at the dusty floor mats, trying to slow my heart rate. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, heavy stone in my gut. During those 2 hours in the car, and the subsequent flight from Tijuana to San Diego, and then the connecting flight to Portland, I had time to think. I had time to dissect the why. A man doesn't betray his father just for money. Money is the tool, not the root. If Brandon just needed cash, he could have asked. I have bailed him out before. I paid off his credit cards when he was 25. I helped him with the down payment on his first condo. No, this was about something deeper. I thought about the way Brandon used to look at my work boots when I came home in the evenings. He would wrinkle his nose at the smell of solder and sweat. He always hated that his father was a tradesman. He wanted the clean hands of an investment banker or a tech CEO. He wanted the status. He resented that the money providing his comfortable life came from dirty blue-collar work. By selling my house, the house I built extensions on with my own hands, he wasn't just liquidating an asset. He was erasing the evidence of who I was. He was sanitizing his history. He wanted the inheritance without the man attached to it. He wanted to put me in a home in Mexico so he could tell his friends at the country club that his father was retired abroad in a luxury villa, rather than facing the reality that he had discarded me like a rusted part. He underestimated me because he never respected me. He mistook my silence for stupidity and my patience for weakness. He forgot that you don't run a business for 40 years without learning how to spot a liar and how to handle a crisis. I landed in Portland at 11 p.m. It was raining. The familiar scent of wet asphalt and pine needles hit me as I stepped out of the terminal. It was the smell of home, but tonight it smelled like a battlefield. I didn't call a friend. I didn't call Leonard. I needed to see it with my own eyes first. I took an Uber to my neighborhood in Laurelhurst. I had the driver drop me off a block away. I walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows of the old oak trees that lined the street. My house sat on the corner, dark and silent. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. And there it was, the for sale sign planted in the center of my lawn, right through the roots of the hydrangea bush I had planted for Martha on our 30th anniversary. A red sold banner was slapped diagonally across it. My chest tightened. Seeing it online was one thing. Seeing the physical stake in my ground was another. It felt like a violation. I walked up the driveway. My truck was gone. He must have sold it or moved it to a storage lot. The garage door was closed. I walked to the front porch. I reached for my keys, then stopped. Of course, he would have changed the locks. That's the first thing a realtor does. I tried the handle anyway, locked. I peered through the living room window. The street lamp provided just enough light to see inside. My furniture was still there, my leather armchair, the antique clock, the rug Martha loved, but it looked staged. The personal items were gone. The photos on the mantelpiece, the pictures of Brandon graduating, the pictures of Martha and me in Hawaii were missing. He had already scrubbed me from the premises. I felt a surge of despair, but I pushed it down. Despair is useless. Despair is what they wanted me to feel in that nursing home in Ensenada. I walked around to the back of the house. The backyard was fenced, private. I went to the basement bulkhead doors. They were padlocked, a shiny new master lock gleaming in the dark. Brandon had been thorough, but Brandon grew up in this house as a guest. I built this house. I knew its bones. I knew its secrets. I remembered the small ventilation access panel behind the rhododendrons on the east side of the foundation. I had installed it myself 10 years ago to service the crawlspace ductwork. It wasn't a door. It was a tight squeeze, meant for emergencies or maintenance. It was secured from the inside, but I knew the latch was loose because I had been meaning to fix it since last spring. I pushed through the wet bushes, not caring about the mud ruining my clothes. I found the panel. I pressed my hand against the corner, applying pressure in the exact spot where the wood was warped. It gave way with a groan. I slid the panel aside. The smell of damp earth and old concrete drifted out. It was the smell of the crawl space, the underbelly of the house. I squeezed my shoulders through the opening. It was tight, much tighter than it used to be, but I dragged myself in, scraping my elbows, pulling my body into the darkness under my own floorboards. I lay there for a moment in the dirt, breathing heavy, listening to the house settle above me. I was inside, but being inside wasn't enough. I needed leverage. I needed something that would override a power of attorney, something that would stop a sale dead in its tracks. I crawled toward the corner of the basement where I kept my dead archives. Brandon would have cleared out the office, the safe, and the filing cabinets. But he wouldn't have checked the false bottom of the tool chest in the utility room because he never touched a tool in his life. There was a document in that chest, a notarized amendment to the deed that I had drawn up years ago when I had my first heart scare. It was a life estate provision I had considered filing but never did, or so he thought. If I could find it, and if I could get it to Leonard, we could prove that Brandon had knowingly withheld critical property records. But as I crawled toward the trap door that led up to the utility room, I heard a sound above me. Footsteps. Heavy, booted footsteps on the hardwood floor of the living room. I froze. The house was supposed to be empty. Brandon had his own condo across town. The new owners weren't supposed to take possession until closing. Someone was in my house. And they weren't just walking. They were pacing. Then I heard a voice. It was muffled through the floorboards, but unmistakable. It was Brandon, and he wasn't alone. He was speaking to someone, and his tone wasn't triumphant. He sounded panicked. "I don't care what she said," Brandon hissed, his voice vibrating through the wood above my head. "The old man isn't answering the phone at the facility. Joyce has gone dark. If he comes back before the wire transfer hits tomorrow morning, we are all going to prison." I lay in the dirt, holding my breath. He knew something had gone wrong, but he didn't know the ghost he was afraid of was currently lying 6 inches beneath his feet. I had to get to that tool chest. But to get there, I had to come up through the floor right in the next room. I waited for the footsteps to move away. Lying in the dirt of the crawl space, with spiders nesting in the corners and the smell of damp earth filling my lungs, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Above me, the floorboards creaked. The footsteps were heavy, frantic. I recognized the pacing. It was Brandon. But there was a second set of steps, sharp, clicking heels, a dress shoe. I pressed my ear against the subflooring of the living room. The insulation baffled the sound, but I could hear the voices clearly enough. One voice was my son's. He sounded like a man drowning. He kept repeating that he couldn't get a hold of Joyce, that the facility wasn't confirming my intake. The other voice was smooth, oily. I didn't recognize it, but I recognized the tone. It was the tone of a man who sells things that don't belong to him. He told Brandon to calm down. He insisted that the wire transfer was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. Monday morning, and that the demolition crew was booked for Tuesday. My blood ran cold. Demolition. They weren't just selling my home to a family who would love it. They were selling it as a teardown. They were selling the land. The house I built, the garden Martha planted, the height chart carved into the kitchen doorframe, it was all going to be bulldozed into a dumpster by Tuesday afternoon. They were erasing 40 years of life to pay off a debt in 48 hours. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was fighting for my history. I waited for the footsteps to move toward the kitchen. The moment they did, I shimmied toward the trap door that led to the utility room. It was a tight squeeze. My shoulders scraped against the joists, and I felt a nail tear the sleeve of my shirt, but I didn't stop. Pain is just information. Right now, it told me I was still alive. I pushed the trapdoor up. It was heavy, covered by a rug I had placed there years ago. I lifted it an inch, listening. Silence in the utility room. I slid out of the hole, my joints popping as I stood up. I was in the back of the house. The air here was stale. I moved silently to the large red Craftsman tool chest in the corner. This was my altar. This was where I kept the tools that built this life. Brandon hadn't touched it. To him, this chest was just a heavy, greasy box of junk. He didn't know that the bottom drawer, the one labeled scrap metal, had a false bottom. I pulled the drawer open. I lifted the metal plate. There it was, the Mercer Family Revocable Trust. 5 years ago, after a minor heart attack, Leonard had advised me to protect the assets. We moved the deed of the house into the trust. I was the sole trustee. Brandon was the beneficiary only upon my death. Crucially, the trust document required 2 signatures for any sale of real estate if I were incapacitated, mine and Leonard's. Brandon's power of attorney was worthless against the trust. He had listed the house as Silas Mercer, owner, but the title search on Monday morning would flag the discrepancy. The sale would stall, but a stalled sale wouldn't stop a desperate man. It would just make him dangerous. I needed to ensure he couldn't fake the second signature. I needed the original embossed seal. I grabbed the thick binder. I also grabbed the spare set of keys for the detached workshop, my sanctuary at the back of the lot. As I tucked the binder under my arm, I saw something on the workbench that didn't belong. It was a crumpled piece of paper, smoothed out and left near a coffee cup. It was a demand letter, but not from a bank. It was from a private lending firm in Las Vegas. The amount demanded was staggering, $200,000 plus accrued interest. The deadline was last Friday. The puzzle pieces snapped together. Brandon wasn't investing in a condo. He was in the hole, deep. He had borrowed money from people who break legs, and now he was liquidating his father to save his own kneecaps. The kitchen door creaked. They were coming back toward the hallway. I had seconds. I couldn't go back into the crawlspace. I'd be trapped. I couldn't go out the front. They'd see me. I looked at the side door that led to the garden. It was bolted. If I unlocked it, the click would echo like a gunshot in the silent house. I grabbed a heavy rag from the bench and pressed it over the deadbolt. I turned the lock slowly, feeling the mechanism grind through the cloth. It made a dull thud, but it didn't click. "Did you hear that?" the smooth voice asked from the hallway. "Hear what?" Brandon's voice was trembling. "I hear everything, man. I'm losing it." "Relax. It's an old house. It settles." I slipped out the door and closed it gently behind me, leaving it unlocked. I crouched low, moving behind the overgrown rhododendrons, making my way through the darkness toward the detached workshop at the edge of the property. I let myself in and locked the heavy steel door from the inside. The workshop smelled of sawdust and engine oil. It was soundproofed. I used to run table saws in here at midnight. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved by memory to the window that overlooked the house. I watched the 2 silhouettes moving in my living room. I had the trust documents. I had the knowledge of his debt. And I had the high ground. Brandon thought I was thousands of miles away, helpless. He didn't know I was 30 yards away, watching him through the scope of my own life, holding the paperwork that would bury him. He wanted a quick sale. I was going to give him a closing day he would never forget, but I couldn't just stop the sale. If I stopped it, the loan sharks would come for him, and despite everything, despite the betrayal, the theft, and the cruelty, he was still my son. I realized I had to do something harder than just winning. I had to destroy his scheme without getting him killed by his creditors. Or maybe I needed to let him face the wolves he invited to the door. I sat on my shop stool, the trust binder on my lap, and waited for the sun to rise. The game had changed. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the judge. The sun rises differently when you know it's going to be a day of reckoning. It doesn't break gently. It burns through the mist, stripping away the shadows where the rats have been hiding. I watched the dawn turn the sky from charcoal to a bruised purple through the grime of my workshop window. I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired. I was calibrated. My workshop is more than a place for tools. It's a capsule of my life. In the back corner, there is a cedar closet where I keep my Sunday best, a charcoal wool suit, a pressed white shirt, and a pair of polished Oxfords. I started keeping them there years ago after a pipe burst in the main house closet ruined half my wardrobe. It seemed fitting that I would dress for war in the same room where I sharpened my chisels. I stripped off my travel-stained clothes. I washed myself in the deep utility sink with a bar of abrasive mechanics soap in freezing cold water. The shock of the cold against my skin tightened my focus. I shaved using the mirror over the workbench, carefully navigating the deep lines of my face with a straight razor. I didn't recognize the old man in the reflection as a victim anymore. The eyes staring back were hard, clear, and completely devoid of fear. I dressed slowly, methodically, treating every button like a latch being secured. When I tied my tie, I didn't choke it. I made the knot perfect. I looked like I was going to a funeral. In a way, I was. I was going to bury my son's illusions. At 7:00 a.m., I used the landline in the workshop, a dust-covered rotary phone that Brandon had probably forgotten existed. I called Leonard. Leonard answered on the first ring. He was already at his office. I told him the plan. He argued at first. He insisted that we should serve the injunction immediately, before the buyers even arrived. He warned me that letting the signing proceed was dangerous legal territory. I corrected him. I explained that if we stopped them now, Brandon would just claim it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error. He would play the confused son card. I needed him to commit. I needed the signature on the page. I needed the fraud to be consummated in the eyes of the law, so there would be no walking it back. I told Leonard to have the police on standby, but to wait for my signal. I wanted the buyers, the notary, and the loan shark in the room. I wanted them to feel the victory before I took it away. Leonard went silent, then agreed. He said he would be parked down the street at 9:45 a.m. I spent the next 2 hours waiting. Waiting is a skill. Most people fidget. They check their phones. They pace. A sniper waits. A hunter waits. A mechanic waits for the system to pressurize to check for leaks. I sat on my stool, the trust binder on the workbench, next to a ball-peen hammer, and I watched the house. At 8:30 a.m., a black SUV pulled up. The man who stepped out wasn't a family man looking for a craftsman home. He was slick, wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck. He walked around the property, not looking at the garden or the architecture, but looking at the lot lines. He kicked the dirt. He pointed at the roof, not to inspect the shingles, but to gesture how easily it would come down. This was the developer. He was the executioner of my legacy. The man from the night before, the one with the oily voice, joined him. They laughed. I saw them shake hands. They were already celebrating the kill. At 9:00 a.m., Brandon came out to the porch. From 30 yards away, even through the dirty glass, I could see he was unraveling. He was smoking a cigarette, a habit he hid from me for 20 years. He was pacing, checking his phone, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to pull. He was terrified of the loan sharks, terrified of the lies, terrified of the silence from Mexico. He should have been terrified of the workshop. At 9:45 a.m., the final car arrived. A sedan with a magnetic sign on the door. Mobile notary. The cast was assembled. The stage was set. I watched them all gather in the living room. I could see them through the large bay window. Brandon sat at the head of the dining table, my dining table. The developer sat opposite him, a stack of checks on the wood. The shark stood in the corner, arms crossed, the enforcer ensuring the transaction went through. The notary began pulling documents from her bag, laying them out in neat, white rows. They were selling my life. They were carving up the carcass while it was still warm. I stood up. I picked up the trust binder. I didn't take the hammer. I didn't need it. The paperwork was heavier than any tool I owned. I walked to the door of the workshop. I unlocked it. The steel mechanism clicked, a sound of finality. I stepped out into the morning light. The air was crisp. The grass was wet with dew. I walked across the lawn I had mowed 1,000 times. I walked past the rose bushes. I walked past the basement bulkhead. I didn't sneak. I didn't run. I walked with the slow, inevitable cadence of a storm front moving in. I reached the back door of the house, the kitchen entrance. It was unlocked just as I had left it. I turned the handle. I could hear them in the dining room. The notary was speaking. She was reciting the standard legal preamble, asking Brandon if he was acting as the rightful agent for Silas Mercer, asking if he had the authority to convey the title. I heard Brandon's voice. It was weak, cracking. He said, "Yes, I have the authority." I stepped into the kitchen. The floorboards didn't creak. I knew where to step. I walked through the kitchen and stopped in the archway that led to the dining room. They were all looking at the papers. The notary was pointing a pen at the signature line. Brandon was holding a pen, the tip hovering over the paper. The shark was leaning forward, his eyes on the money. The room was silent, filled with the tension of $1 million changing hands. I cleared my throat. It wasn't a loud sound, it was a low rumble, like a furnace kicking on in a quiet house. "I don't think that pen has enough ink for what you're trying to do, son." 5 heads snapped up at once. Brandon dropped the pen. It clattered onto the table, rolling across the documents, leaving a stray mark of black ink like a scar. His face went white, not pale, but the color of ash. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. The shark reached into his jacket. The developer froze. The notary gasped and pulled the papers back. I didn't smile. I didn't yell. I just stood there in my charcoal suit, holding the binder that proved I was the only man in the room who owned the ground they were standing on. I looked at Brandon. I looked him dead in the eye. "You're sitting in my chair," I said. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. It was the kind of vacuum that happens right before a boiler explodes, when the pressure has nowhere left to go. The pen Brandon had dropped was still rolling, a tiny plastic sound against the mahogany table that seemed to echo like a gunshot. Brandon didn't stand up to greet me. He collapsed inward, his shoulders hunched, his face drained of blood, and his mouth opened and closed without producing a single syllable. He looked at me as if he were trying to reconcile the memory of the confused, shuffled-off old man he had sent to Mexico with the figure in the charcoal suit standing in the archway. The developer was the first to break the paralysis. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He demanded to know who I was and what I was doing in a private closing. He looked at Brandon for an explanation, but my son was catatonic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I walked into the room with the steady, heavy rhythm of a man inspecting his own property. I walked past the loan shark, who had tensed up, his hand dipping toward his waistband. I didn't flinch. I simply told him that if he was reaching for a weapon, he should know that my lawyer and 2 police officers were currently parking their squad car at the end of the driveway. I advised him that his best bet was to be invisible. The shark's eyes darted to the window. He saw the flashing lights reflecting off the wet leaves of the oak trees. He didn't pull a weapon. He stepped back, fading into the corner, assessing his exit route. I reached the head of the table. Brandon was still sitting in my chair. I didn't ask him to move. I just stood next to him and looked down. The sheer weight of my presence, the smell of my soap, the reality of my return, it was too much for him. He scrambled out of the seat, nearly tripping over his own feet, retreating until his back hit the china cabinet. I sat down. I placed the heavy binder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood made the notary jump. I looked at the woman. She was young, terrified, clutching her stamp like a talisman. I asked her gently if she had verified the identity of the seller against the current deed of trust. She stammered. She looked at the paperwork. She tried to explain that Brandon had a power of attorney. I opened the binder. I turned it around so they could all read the bold text on the first page. The Mercer Family Revocable Trust. I explained to the room that the power of attorney they were relying on was subordinate to this trust. I pointed out the clause that required 2 signatures, mine and my attorney's, for any transfer of real estate. I informed them that by attempting to close this sale with only a POA, they were participating in title fraud. The developer turned on the notary. He started shouting, asking how she missed this. He accused her of incompetence. He turned to Brandon and screamed that he had wasted his time and capital. I held up a hand. The room went quiet again. I turned my attention to the developer. I told him that his incompetence was the least of his worries. I told him that I knew about the demolition order scheduled for Tuesday. I asked him if he really thought he could bulldoze a man's life while he was still breathing. He didn't answer. He started gathering his checkbook and his tablet. He mumbled something about a misunderstanding, about being misled by the seller. He looked at Brandon with pure venom. He said the deal was dead. I corrected him. I told him the deal wasn't just dead. It was evidence. I told him to leave the papers on the table. The developer looked at the door, then at me. He left the papers. He walked out the front door without looking back. The notary followed him, apologizing to the air, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood as she fled the scene of the crime. That left 3 of us, me, my son, and the shark in the corner. The shark, the man with the oily voice I had heard the night before, stepped forward. He wasn't scared of the law like the others. He was focused on the money. He ignored me and looked at Brandon. He stated calmly that the debt was still owed. He reminded Brandon that the arrangement had a deadline, and that the deadline was today. Brandon was shaking. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He was waiting for his father to step in. He was waiting for the man who paid his college tuition, who fixed his first car, who bailed him out of credit card debt, to write one more check. He expected me to save him from the wolf he had invited into our home. I looked at the shark. I told him that whatever business he had with my son was between them. I informed him that not a single penny from my accounts or my property would ever be used to service that debt. I told him that if he wanted his money, he should look at the man cowering by the china cabinet, because that man had just spent the last of his liquidity on a first-class cruise ticket and a deposit for a Mexican nursing home. The shark smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. He nodded at me, a gesture of respect for a fellow hard man. He told Brandon he would be in touch. Then he slipped out the side door, vanishing into the garden. Now it was just the 2 of us. The silence that stretched between us was heavy with 40 years of history. I looked at Brandon. I saw the boy I taught to ride a bike. I saw the teenager I taught to drive. And I saw the man who tried to sell me for scrap. He finally spoke. His voice was a wreck. He tried to laugh, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. He told me he was glad I was back. He tried to spin the narrative. He claimed that he had been worried about my health, that the doctors had told him I needed full-time care. He said the house was too much for me to manage alone. He insisted that he was only trying to help, that the sale was to generate money for my long-term comfort. I didn't blink. I didn't yell. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the admission form for Sunset Paradise Living. I slid it across the table. I asked him if long-term comfort usually involved a facility with a 1-star safety rating and a lockdown ward. I asked him why he had forged a dementia diagnosis. I asked him why he had emptied my retirement accounts before the sale even closed. He tried to interrupt, to throw up a wall of words, claiming it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding with the paperwork. I stopped him. I told him that I had been under the floorboards. He froze. I told him I heard him last night. I heard him say that he didn't care what happened to me as long as the wire transfer hit. I heard him bartering my existence for a reprieve from his gambling debts. The color drained from his face for the second time. He realized there was no lie left to tell. The foundation was stripped bare. Leonard walked through the front door then. He was followed by 2 uniformed officers. Leonard looked at the scene, the scattered papers, the terrified son, the father sitting like a judge at the head of the table. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to me. I stood up. I walked over to where Brandon was standing. He flinched, expecting a blow. I would never hit him. Violence is for men who can't use words or tools. I had both. I handed him a folder Leonard had prepared. Inside was a restraining order and a formal eviction notice. I told him that he had 10 minutes to remove his personal effects from the premises. I told him that the locks were being changed at noon. I told him that the police were here to ensure he left peacefully, but if he refused, they were also here to take a statement regarding the fraud, the forgery, and the elder abuse. Brandon looked at the papers, then at me. He started to cry. It wasn't the crying of remorse. It was the crying of a child who had been caught. He asked me where he was supposed to go. He said he had nowhere. He said the people he owed money to would hurt him. I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even me. I told him that was a problem for a man to solve. I told him he had spent his whole life resting on my shoulders, assuming I would always be the floorboards beneath his feet. I pointed to the door. I told him that I was done being the foundation for a house that didn't respect its builder. He tried to argue one last time. He called me Dad. I turned my back on him. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. I heard the officers step forward. I heard them ask him to come along. I heard the front door open and close. I didn't turn around. I watched the police cruiser escort him off the property. I watched his car, the one he bought with my money, sitting in the driveway, knowing it would be repossessed by the end of the week. I was alone in the house. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. It was the silence of a job well done, the silence of a structure that had been tested by a hurricane and was still standing. I sat back down in my leather chair. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It smelled like home. But the work wasn't quite finished. There was one more thing to do. The first thing I did after the police cruiser faded from view was call a locksmith. Not the emergency 24-hour service with the flashy van, but a guy I've known for 20 years, a man named Miller, who operates out of a brick and mortar shop on Hawthorne. When he arrived, he didn't ask why I was changing the tumblers on a house I'd lived in for 4 decades. He saw the exhaustion in my eyes and the grim set of my jaw, and he simply went to work. The sound of the drill biting into the wood was the sweetest music I had heard in a week. It was the sound of re-establishing the perimeter. By 2:00 p.m., every lock in the house was new. By 3:00 p.m., I had installed a digital security system with cameras covering every approach. I wasn't paranoid. I was simply applying the lessons I had just paid a fortune to learn. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings and forensic accounting. Leonard was a bulldog. Once we had the police report regarding the attempted fraud and the elder abuse, he went on the offensive. We tracked Joyce down. It turned out she wasn't exactly an employee of Sunset Paradise Living. She was an independent recruiter who received kickbacks for every head of cattle she drove into their pen. Leonard filed complaints with the California Attorney General and the Mexican consulate. The last I heard, she was facing an indictment for wire fraud in San Diego. She won't be waiting on any cruise ship decks anytime soon. The financial damage was real. The cash Brandon had drained, my liquid savings, the emergency fund, was largely gone. He had torched it on gambling debts and lifestyle inflation before I even boarded the ship. Leonard asked if I wanted to sue Brandon for restitution. I told him no. You can't draw water from a stone, and you can't get blood from a ghost. Brandon was bankrupt. A lawsuit would just be a piece of paper. I had already given him the ultimate punishment. I had cut the cord. People ask me what happened to him. They expect a dramatic ending, maybe a prison sentence, or a violent confrontation with his loan sharks. The reality is sadder, and in some ways harsher. Brandon didn't go to jail, but he went to his own kind of prison. The condo he had put a down payment on was seized. His car was repossessed. The loan sharks, businessmen of a brutal variety, didn't break his legs, but they garnished his life. They took his watches, his electronics, and his dignity. A friend of mine saw him about 3 months ago. He told me Brandon is working the night shift at a warehouse distribution center near the airport, loading trucks. He lives in a studio apartment above a laundromat. He looks 10 years older. He has tried to call me. I see the number pop up on my phone. I don't block it, but I don't answer it. I let it ring until it stops. Listening to the silence that follows is part of my daily discipline. It's a reminder that access to my life is a privilege, not a birthright. He had the keys to the kingdom, and he tried to sell the castle. He doesn't get to come back in just because it's raining. As for the house, I made a decision. For a moment, I considered selling it. The memory of him sitting in my chair, signing it away, had tainted the air. But then I realized that selling would be letting him win. It would be admitting that he had successfully poisoned my sanctuary. So I renovated. I didn't just paint the walls. I gutted the rooms that held the bad memories. Brandon's old bedroom is gone. I knocked down the wall between it and the hallway and built a library. I filled it with leather-bound books, a humidor, and a drafting table where I sketch plans for fun. I reclaimed the space. I stripped the wallpaper Martha liked but I always hated, and I painted the walls a deep slate blue. I bought new furniture, solid, heavy oak that fits me. The house doesn't look like a family home anymore. It looks like a bachelor's fortress. And for the first time in 40 years, it feels entirely mine. I didn't stop working, but I changed the nature of the work. I liquidated the heavy assets of Mercer Climate Control and transitioned to a consulting role. I don't crawl in crawl spaces anymore. Now, I teach young men how to run a business without losing their souls. I realized that my mistake with Brandon wasn't that I didn't love him enough. It was that I shielded him too much. I never let him feel the weight of the tools. I just gave him the fruit of the labor. So I started the Mercer Trade Scholarship. It's a small fund. I take the money I would have left to Brandon as an inheritance, and I use it to pay for trade school for kids who know the value of a callus. I've got 3 young men I mentor now. They come over to the workshop on Saturdays. We work on engines, we fix old furnaces, and we talk about life. They treat me with a respect my own blood never did. They listen, they learn, and they know that if they ever try to cross me, the door shuts forever. Last month, I finally took that drive down the coast. I didn't hire a driver. I gassed up my truck, threw a cooler in the back, and drove Route 101 from Oregon to the border. I stopped where I wanted. I ate seafood in small shacks by the water. I watched the sunset without a scheduled activity or a care coordinator hovering over me. When I got to San Diego, I drove to the port. I parked the truck and walked to the fence where you can see the cruise ships docked. They looked like floating hotels, massive and grotesque. I saw the line of passengers boarding, eager for their buffet and their illusion of luxury. I thought about the old man who boarded that ship months ago. He was tired. He was trusting. He was ready to let go of the wheel. I'm not that man anymore. I drove back north, taking the slow road. I stopped in the redwood forests. Standing at the base of those giant trees, some of them 2,000 years old, you realize what resilience actually looks like. They have thick bark. They've survived fires, droughts, and storms. They don't survive by being soft. They survive by being deeply rooted and undeniably hard. I am back in Portland now. The rain is falling against the library window as I write this. The security monitor shows the street is empty. The house is quiet. Some might call it lonely. I call it peaceful. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. I was almost abandoned. Now I am simply alone by choice. I have my health, I have my home, I have my mind, and most importantly, I have the knowledge that when the test came, when the people I trusted tried to erase me, I didn't fold. I fought, and I won. I sit in my leather chair, a glass of scotch in my hand, not to drown sorrows, but to toast the victory. I look at the fireplace I built with my own hands. The fire is burning steady and hot. There's a lesson here for every man watching this. We spend our lives building things, businesses, families, homes. We assume that the people we build them for will appreciate the sacrifice. But sometimes the people you build the roof over are the ones pulling the bricks out of the foundation. Check your locks, check your paperwork, and never ever let anyone convince you that you're done before you decide you're done. If you're watching this from a house you built, wondering who's going to inherit the keys, ask yourself this. If you disappeared tomorrow, would they mourn the man, or would they just fight over the map to the safe? I want to know where you stand. Tell me in the comments. Are you the builder, or are you the one waiting for the inheritance? And if the wolves came to your door tomorrow, would you have the strength to send them away? If this story woke something up in you, subscribe to the channel. We talk about reality here, not fairy tales.